All right, let's head over to the Zoom line up in the cloud where we've got Mr. Joe Sinnott, Whitting Partners, on the horn with us here today. How you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, Jason. Happy to be here with you today.
Nice color red. I see we both got our red today on. Happy Father's Day, belated Father's Day, a week after that. And did you do anything exciting for Father's Day?
Recovered from vacation with my children and my wife, so that was Sunday's activity.
That's always a good Father's Day. So, well, a lot of stuff to talk about, but we're going to start off by talking about a bit of news happening out in the Marcellus shale play where Joe Sinnott is located geographically. Of course, he goes anywhere when hired, but he's based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, part of that Marcellus Appalachia shale play. Utica, we can even throw in there. And they did a 5 mile lateral and is it a well record too? There's like three or four records, five records that were done, Joe. It's hard, it's hard to keep up with so many records that have happened in the last 10 years, but it's Expand Energy. And did you see this news story? Are you aware of this in any way, Joe?
Yeah, I did see that float through a couple different areas. I think the LinkedIn feed and some other daily emails I get with updates. But yeah, that rose to the top there a couple days ago.
So what all is involved with that? Because when I was dealing with the covering of it in the Bakken, they had like a 3 mile, or they were just finishing up a 3 mile lateral, and that was like an incredible thing. And these wells, they walk. I don't know if they do out in the Marcellus, but in the Bakken they walk, and of course they go down and horizontal over, and they do these types of things. And a lot of it depends on the different, I guess, geography or the topography, if you will. And a good example is a lot of these shale formations. It's easier to frack them and crack them and split them, and so you can extract the oil out. But when you start getting down into like the Mississippi Tuscaloosa shale play, it's a little more clay, a little more mud-like, and so it doesn't work as well. And so I imagine you run into a lot of different hiccups. You run into a lot of different just bumps and bruises along the way. Joe, did you ever work on anything along these lines? Your energy companies in the past, or were you in a different section of the energy sector?
No, most of my time is spent on the upstream side, so I'm intimately familiar with the seemingly ever increasing length of these laterals. I mean, that was all the story. When I first started the Marcellus around 2008 there, just as the Marcellus was kicking off, you were looking at 3,000-foot laterals. That was kind of the standard. And then to see them progress, as you said, to upwards of 5 miles, like the lateral that Expand drilled, that's been the story. And obviously, I mean, we can spend hours talking about why that's important, what that's meant for the industry when it comes to, manufacturing these wells. But I'd say the biggest story with all of this, Jason, is how small of a surface footprint you can have for a vast drainage of rock beneath our feet. That's what these long laterals allow you to do. And as you was, were saying in terms of how these wells walk, if you will, underground, the three-dimensional aspect. You're not just going down and out, but you're going down and over and out. So you have multiple well bores drilled from a single pad covering, thousands of acres that you're then able to drain. So again, without the benefit of my whiteboard behind me and lots of time where we can get into the specifics of it, the moral of the story is, Jason, the lengthening of laterals has meant tremendous efficiencies, cost savings, and again, most significantly, smaller footprints, which is tremendous from an environmental standpoint.
That is one of the things that is the more incredible stories. That is, in my opinion, the underreported part of the oil and gas industry. And I'm sure there's incredible savings by being able to do a lateral drill versus having to tear down and move 100 yards over to drill, and that's where I don't know what the distance was before, but you had to, because you just went straight down basically. And so the horizontal drilling completely changed the industry. So when you're talking about from a supply chain savings, you're talking about a logistical savings. But to me, man, the regulatory savings, the footprint savings, the environmental savings, that has got to be just a silver star, a gold star, if you will, for the industry, Joe. Um, was that talked about much in the board rooms, in the executive rooms? Because I never hear the news talking about it outside of shows like the Crude Life and, maybe some energy show that's a specialty show on the History Channel. You don't hear much about that. And man, in today's day and age, you'd think that that would lead a lot of the news stories today. But that's just, I guess, a biased opinion. But
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess to answer your question, that the idea of longer lateral lengths was absolutely, I would say, a top conversation in boardrooms, especially if you go back, say, 10 or so years ago, because, that was a competitive advantage. If you can drill longer laterals, and certainly up here in, Pennsylvania in particular, and West Virginia, where the expand lateral was drilled, uh, you know, amassing the acreage necessary to drill wells, it's not easy. So when you can simplify things by having one pad location, especially again, we're not flat here in Appalachia, or at least, most of Appalachia. So, when you can have one drilling location on the, top of a mountain and then access again, miles and miles and in every direction, that's a huge advantage. And that absolutely was a differentiator, a competitive advantage for a lot of companies and was therefore a hot topic in boardrooms, Jason. Fast forward to today, I'll be honest, again, I'm not in those conversations anymore now in my new role. However, personally, sometimes it feels like, you kind of get desensitized to this. Yeah, we know, yeah, longer laterals is, can be more efficient, so on and so forth. But even the expand news is kind of like, all right, great, you set another record today. Who's going to set one tomorrow? Now, again, that's me saying it. That's not to disparage, obviously, what expand and their service providers did, but it's sort of understood that longer laterals, so long as you can then go on and complete the wells efficiently, that's the way to go.
it is true, though. I mean, a lot of times you break a record, and boy, the mayor will come out and give you an award, and the Chamber of Commerce will come out, and you'll get a ribbon cutting, and pretty soon you're breaking more records, and nobody cares. Doesn't even make the newspaper, doesn't even make the nightly news. The press releases just get ignored. Everybody's like, oh, seen that, been there, done that. But taking a look at these, and then we'll go ahead and transition into another area. But here's the records they broke, Joe. This is Rig EDC 41. Longest lateral in the U.S. land, 27,657 feet. Longest well in the U.S. land. So first is the longest lateral. Next is the longest well in U.S. land, 34,507 feet. Next, this one I want a little bit of context on, Joe, because my background is more from the media and communication side of things when it comes to the oil and gas. So when it comes to a lot of, drill heads and bits and those types of things, I'm not as familiar with that as far as the appreciation like I should. Sure, I've seen them and I've felt them, but I haven't been on a rig when certain things have been done and around the boardroom and certain things have been done. So this one, I believe, is probably bigger than I'm going to make it seem, which is the longest single bit BHA run in U.S. land of 30,368 feet. Now, does that mean that they used one single bit before they had to change it for that many feet? Is that what that record is?
Yeah, when they're referencing the BHA, the bottom hole assembly, that's all those tools together. So one single bit run means they went down, they drilled that distance, and then they came out. Because you could drill a super long well, but if it takes you, months and months and months and lots of bits and lots of downtime and lots of money, well, that's not necessarily something to pat yourself on the back for. But for Expand to say, hey, not only did we drill the longest well on U.S. land, but we also did it again, seemingly quite efficiently by not having to go in and out and make multiple bit trips, Jason. That adds a little a big extra nugget, if you will, to that record.
I would think that the crew and whoever had the bit equipment, I would parlay this record into as many job opportunities as possible, because just the savings alone, like you said, just not changing the bits, that's a huge time and money savings. three more records that were done, six total for this rig EDC 41 Expand Energy. 48-hour footage world record of 21,314 feet. Expand Energy 24-hour footage record of 12,370 feet, and Expand Energy footage per day record of 2,774 feet per day. So unbelievable that more records are being done. And just wanted to take a moment because, Joe, you brought up a great point that records are being broken all the time. And even us within the industry, we'll ignore it, look the other way. Hey, what's Shedeur Sanders up to today? You know, go take a look at a news piece outside the industry that has absolutely nothing to do with anything. And here we got Expand Energy breaking records, Joe. So anyway, all right. So any final thoughts on that before we transition? Are we good there?
I think the last thing I'll emphasize, and you touched on it, but to have an appreciation for all of the different parties that are involved in records like that, again, I think a lot of people don't have that appreciation outside the industry. So it's not just Expand, the operator who's paying the bills, and obviously they have personnel involved in the engineering of the well, the decisions, the operational decisions, but all the different variables. The rig company, the mud providers, obviously the bit company, and any of the tools that are involved in that bottom hole assembly that are helping to steer that well, and so on and so forth. There's so many different third parties involved to make this happen that I think, again, makes it an even greater accomplishment, right? To be able to get that done with the record-setting efficiencies that they did.
Joe, I feel like we should make a dent in the industry today. So here's how I believe that we can make a dent in the industry. I think Expand Energy should be invited to the White House for this record. I think Chris Wright with the Department of Energy should invite Expand Energy and the crew that did this to the White House to get an award for this, because we are in the middle of an energy important independent campaign that's going on. And I'm sorry, but winning the Super Bowl is great, but doing this record is just as important, Joe. If we can invite these sports teams to the White House to get an award, I think that we can create a very good case and possibly a campaign to get Expand Energy Rig EDC 41 to get them a proper, White House accolade, I guess is the word I'm looking for, Joe. Am I
No,
out of
actually,
my mind,
I'm listening to you and thinking of the visual of, actually rigging up on the White House lawn. And then I don't know my Washington, D.C. geography, but I mean, what is a 5-mile radius around the White House, right? If you started drilling at the White House, my guess is you could touch a whole bunch of Washington, D.C. or under Washington, D.C. I mean, think about that visual, right? Of how amazing it is to go that far underground, steering this, BHA. That would be, that might highlight for a lot of folks who aren't familiar with the industry how impressive these things are.
Is DC even 5 miles wide?
That's what I'm wondering here. Again,
DC's not very big.
I'll claim complete ignorance, but
Manhattan's not very big either. So I mean, we're talking about, this is some incredible stuff here, Joe.
Yeah, and again, I think your average
well, I tell you what,
does not have that appreciation.
We have something here. Well, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna send some. Well, Chris Wright's been on the program before, as Ron Gusick, the now current president of Liberty. We've had Doug Burgum, Interior Secretary, on the program many times, and I've been in the press corps for 2 Trump speeches. So I at least I've got a couple email addresses of people. If they didn't tick them off, they're still around. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. We'll wait and see. But yeah, I've got a few names. I think we could see if we can get some chatter going up the food chain. So, ladies and gentlemen, if we end up seeing a rig on the White House lawn, that was Joe Sinnott's idea. So.
It's a team effort, and thanks to the real-time ability to research things, it seems like Washington, D.C. is roughly 10 miles by 10 miles. So, we might need to set up 2 pads to drain all of the resources underneath Washington, D.C., Jason. But
this
we'll
is
start
a genius
with 1
idea, Joe. We could set up 4. Okay, 1 going 5 miles one way, one going 5 miles south, east, west, right? That's what we got, right? We got 10 miles there. So if we go 5 miles all directions with a center, we're going 10 by 10. And we
Yeah.
can dub it as we're going to drain the swamp. We're going to drain the swamp with these lateral drilling
Actually,
machines. Okay.
that's the drain the swamp is good, man, Jason. We should just cut it here because no, you're right. You stick that pad in the middle. If it's 10 miles by 10 miles, all you got to do is stick it right in the middle of, I don't know what the geographic center
Right.
of Washington, D.C. is, but that's it. One pad to drain the swamp. All right.
That's it, right? We don't need four. We just need one because it can go four directions. Okay. Well, now we're talking. That see, look at this is why you're a professional, Joe. Look how efficient you are. You just saved me 75% on my idea. On my fictitious idea I had up here, you just gave me 75% more room to grow that. Thank you very much. So popular, popular Joe Sinnott. But that was the best I could do to segue into our main event topic, which is the popular employee has to go. This is something that I saw as a topic, Joe, that's a common thread and a common topic that's been going on in many industries, but also the energy industry, because social media has allowed popularity to create a whole new identity. You've got your traditional, hey, the boss is going out for a smoke break. All of a sudden, everybody that's outside having a smoke break seems to be popular around the boss. So popularity can be somewhat subjective, but when we're talking about the popular employee gets fired, gets laid off, leaves, whatever it might be, it impacts the culture, Joe. It really impacts the culture. Oftentimes when we do sports analysis a lot of times and analogies, and a lot of times your team captain might not be your best player, but he's the person that can bring in your cohesiveness into the locker room and onto the field and etc. So a popular employee can really change the culture in a positive way, but also in a negative way too. But talk to me a little bit about this, Joe, because this is something I've been seeing more and more. Is this something you've experienced in your executive coaching in the industry?
Oh, sure. I've seen it in my executive coaching. I've seen it in my former life, being, as part of the standard corporate world where, yeah, people are always leaving for some reason or another, Jason. So, yeah, I do see it all the time. And obviously, and unfortunately, we see people leaving now in our industry. Just as we talk today, Chevron is in the midst of some fairly public layoffs there. I've seen a fair number of people here just in the last 24 hours who have announced their departure. So, yeah, people are constantly leaving for lots of different reasons, but it does seem different sometimes, Jason, when it is somebody who is, popular or, again, sometimes the popular person is a tremendous asset. And that can then lead to, oh my gosh, why did that person leave? What does that mean for us? So obviously we can dive into that more, but the short answer is, yeah, absolutely. That is a common thing that will certainly continue on for as long as there are employees and employers. Oh, I think you might be muted there,
What's the
Jason. There we
first thing? Sorry, I was on mute there for a second, Joe. I apologize. What's the first thing that somebody should do if they lose someone and they're very well liked, and even if they're an average employee, but their their attitude and just their general being, did so much. Like there's this great episode of The Office when Dwight gets fired or quits, or I can't remember what happens, but he ends up working for Staples, and the next day or a week later, Michael's wondering what's going on with the plants and why is the toys in his office not arranged the way he likes. Well, Dwight did all those things. Sometimes the popular person does things behind the scenes that nobody knows about except for just a few people, and that's how they gain their popularity, grassroots popularity within the office, if you will. So when somebody leaves and they're a positive, but now the positive's leaving, Joe, what how do you even start with something like that? Where do you begin?
Yeah, well, my advice, and again, I do advise leaders on this when they do have people walk out the door or are forced out the door who are popular, as you say. And that is this idea of thinking win-win. Again, not a unique concept, right? This thinking win-win. Stephen Covey is one of his big themes there from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. So it's not a new concept. But when people walk out the door, it's critical for leaders to say, hey, how is this actually good for the company? And how is this good for the person that walked out the door? Because the mistake that I see so often, Jason, is leaders they feel like they can just kind of, go with the flow and make it seem like it's not such a big deal, or maybe they try to rationalize it, and it just becomes this sort of soft, ineffective response to somebody leaving who again was popular, was a valuable asset, whatever the case might be. And what you're left with, Jason, in those situations is a narrative that is completely out of the control of the manager. So when they run into a situation where it's, shoot, yeah, that, like you said, the plants aren't watered, or, oh wow, I didn't even realize the person did this. Like that's gonna create this narrative that's gonna be negative, and it's gonna continue to grow, versus the leader who says, hey, what I like about this is it's a chance for us to, I don't know, in the plant example, find somebody else who actually enjoys plants and wants to bring in their own plant. As silly as that is, Jason, that's the difference between a leader who actually sees the departure of a valuable individual as a positive, genuinely sees it as a positive, and demonstrates to his or her people that it's a positive, versus the leader who's just going to rationalize and, bite their tongue and, just try to get by and tell everybody that it's going to be okay when, they likely suspect otherwise. So that's typically the path that I go down with folks when they encounter this very real and not uncommon situation.
All right, let's turn up the notch a little bit to make this a little bit less popular with Joe Sinnott right now, because now we're going to turn the attention on the manager, on the executive, because that's not an easy conversation, Joe. However, if somebody leaves an organization, now there's a chance that it might be the organization. The organization might become unhealthy or toxic, or might start showing signs of that to the employee. And so therefore the popular employee, because he's popular, he had no problem finding another job. He wouldn't found another job. So my question is, Joe, without losing the job and ticking off the manager, how do you let the manager or the organization know that they're starting to show some signs that employees may not find this to be the most healthy of environments, and so therefore you got a little bit of a leak, buddy? We gotta stop the leak before more employees, now Miss Runner Up at the beauty contest might go next, second place, you know what I mean, from the Monopoly game. I always wondered why the first place ticket wasn't in there. Everybody always got second place, anyways, but you get my point, Joe, right? Because sometimes when the popular employee leaves, some people might follow like a Pied Piper.
Sure. Yeah, and so there's a couple things to that, Jason. The first is in terms of how do you communicate that potential or that reality to a leader who might be inclined to go on the defensive and say, well, no, what are you talking about? My approach is to make sure that I have data. I've multiple times I've raised that type of question to say, hey, is there a chance that this could be an ongoing issue, or are there some underlying problems that might be leading people to walk out the door? And very often, Jason, and this goes all the way to the top, it's met with, well, is that real? Is this really a problem? What is the data? How bad is the turnover? So, for me as a coach, and certainly anybody internally that's trying to ask this question, you got to be ready to say, yeah, is this actually a problem or not? Is this an objective risk that we have? Or is it actually not a big deal? Because sometimes it's not a big deal, Jason. Again, that goes back to controlling the narrative. It might seem like a big deal when some prominent individual walks out the door, but it might not be. So that's that first piece, Jason, which is to, again, be armed with data to be able to answer the question of whether this is real or not.
How
The
about some of
second
those?
piece of that
Oh, go
is,
ahead. Sorry. Yep, go
oh,
ahead. Second
well,
piece.
the
Yep.
second piece is if you're not sure, if you don't have the data, then the simple thing to say to, again, somebody, especially in an executive position, hey, if this were true, if there were a chance that we're going to have a steady stream of valuable employees walking out the door, what could we do now to mitigate that? again, if you can live in that hypothetical without accusing the executive of running a company that is, lacking in culture and causing people to walk out the door, if you can frame it as a hypothetical, you can come up with some very real, almost risk management type exercises that honestly they should be doing in all elements of their business, whether it's related to people or operations or finances or whatever. So those are sort of the two tacks that I take and that I would recommend other people take if they suspect that there is indeed a problem or a potential problem with people leaving.
Is there, I guess, is there workshops or exercises or anything along those lines that are helpful when it comes to these types of departures or changes within a workplace? And the only reason I ask this is because I don't think people understand how difficult it can be to change culture. Like it can, if you've got some sort of toxicity going on, or you have some sort of just hiccup in your culture, it can be very difficult without role playing, without some sort of awareness that needs to be, set into different people. And for me, I'm a father too, and so my son went to Montessori school, and I felt that was extremely important, Joe, because Montessori focused on the three styles of learning: audio, visual, and kinesthetic, which is like a role playing. So they just didn't count to 10. They count to 10 out loud by holding beads. So they have 10 beads and they would go 1, 2, 3. So they felt each one, they would say it, and then they would hear it as well. And a lot of times for, executives, they need to go through all three to get such a good picture of it. That's why what you do is so important, because you bring in the role playing right out of the gate type of a thing. But you understand what I mean when it comes to these culture shifts and these culture changes. This checkbox doesn't work. Checkbox just doesn't work, Joe. You got to do some work, don't you?
Yeah, 100%. And I guess what I'll say to that, hearing you talk, Jason, call it role playing or call it you know, a, emergency response drill or something like that. You know, all of the companies that I work with in some way, shape, or form, they have emergency response plans and teams. They all have their different names for it because it's necessary, right? We're dealing with potentially dangerous operations. So clearly they rehearse when something goes wrong. Something can go wrong and they're ready for it. I try to take that same tack when it comes to personnel, some of these softer things. Why not? It doesn't have to be as grand. It doesn't have to be as public even, but 100%. Let's role play. Hey, what would it look like if you had two or three high performers walk out the door at the same time? How would you respond? Okay, what can we do ahead of time to mitigate that, to preempt that? Those types of conversations, Jason, are huge. And again, nobody would bat an eye when you're doing it for an operational risk. So why wouldn't you do the same thing for some of these softer cultural personnel risks? And so again, that's what I enjoy doing when I go into an organization is kind of poking around and taking the same again mindset approach that I took in my former life from an engineering standpoint, from an operational standpoint, and applying it to the world of human relationships and personnel and culture.
It's kind of interesting when you come from a tangible market and then you're into an intangible market, and going from basically if you're from an oil well, an oil rig, an oil derrick, if you're right there on site, and then you go to a boardroom, that's what I'm talking about. Those are two different, you know, tangible versus intangible. The media is intangible, and farming would be tangible, or selling tires would be tangible, for example. And those skill sets are interesting because we come from a society where you go and you get a trade, and so you can get an tangible skill and put it out into the marketplace. You can become a doctor with a tangible medical skill. You can become a mechanic with a trade, with a tangible skill. When you get into that boardroom area, you get into that media, you get into that realtor, you get into that, there's a certain industry known as the thought worker industry where you need some intangible skills. And that's where it becomes a little bit subjective, Joe. Um, Having a third party come in and identify some skills and some strengths and some weaknesses, that can really go a long way for executives in the intangible marketplace. Have you given that any thought? Do you have any thoughts behind that? Because for me personally, in the media, we would always have a consultant come in twice a year, and they would just give us a report based on their observations of spending a week, because you had to. You just had to. You had to keep your people fresh. You had to keep them sharp. You had to keep them going in different directions, and you had to self correct constantly. And so there was, a little bit more with introducing some new things and that. But talk to me a little bit about that, because the intangible marketplace, having these third sets of eyes and the outside viewpoints, that is almost critical in that industry. And I'm not sure the average person quite knows that, because it is in the tangible industry. OSHA's got to come by once a year. The fire inspector's got to come by once. You see what I mean? Joe, nobody does that in the boardroom. Nobody comes by once a year for anger management. Nobody comes by once a year for, hey, who's a good communicator? And maybe they should. Maybe we should get into that. And I'm stretching a little bit here, Joe, but you get my thread a little bit, I hope.
Sure, and in part because, much of the value that I bring to organizations comes from my independence. It's the third party. It's the, hey, maybe I'm missing something here, but here's my observation, do what you will with it. And if you want to do something with it, then I can help you with that too. But at the very least, my eyes, my ears, this is what I observed. So yeah, I don't know how much we even need to dive into that, Jason, other than we can all benefit. Right, that's it. I mean, you could be top of your game. How many cliches are out there about people top of their game from a sports standpoint who still have coaches, still want that other, third party set of eyes to observe those little things that they can use to, keep growing, keep developing, keep setting records, if you will. So it's no different, when I go into an organization, whether I'm working with somebody at the very top who may very well be an excellent leader, but recognizes that there's still room for improvement, or at least, things that could be done to sustain success. Or whether I'm working with new hires who are just entering the workforce and are looking for those basic tools to make sure that they're, still employed 6 or 12 months later.
Now, I'm going to tell you folks something, little inside baseball from the media world. And I'm not saying it's true in the energy sector. And this is something that Joe Sinnott will never, ever say. That's why I'm saying it, because I no longer work for this organization. But one thing that we used to do, Joe, one of the reasons that we would have the outside consultant come in twice a year, so we had someone to blame. So we had someone to say, well, that's what they said, so we have to listen to them, because we didn't want to take blame for it, Joe. Us in management, we wanted to look at them in the eyes. And sometimes some of the change that we needed, if it would have came from us, they probably would have left. Honestly, they probably would have left, because we don't want to be their friend, but we do want to be their friend. So I mean, anyway, that's a tough area to get into, but that's why I'm saying in the media, outside consultant was great, because, hey, that's what they said, guys. Let's try it. Let's go ahead and try it.
Yeah, but so Jason, it's funny hearing you say that. I say this all the time to my clients. I say, blame me, use me, invoke my name. I actually lean into it. Obviously, we're talking about leadership. People don't want to be making excuses. I tell them all the time, use me as an excuse to try something new, to say something different. Like, hey, Joe asked me to try this. Again, when I'm working with individuals, I'm on the one hand, I'm behind the scenes, right? I'm, sort of working with individuals and helping them craft their messaging and everything else. But typically, people know I'm there. I'm working with multiple individuals. So if people say, hey, Joe asked me to try this, it kind of makes it a little bit easier. They can kind of laugh it off, but they can also try it. They can also try saying something different or doing something different. So it's funny you say that, because I use that to my advantage to make sure that people aren't hesitant to, humor me and try out some of the things that I might be suggesting.
Joe Sinnott, Winning Partners, and he's the host of the Energy Detox podcast. New episode coming out. When do you think, Joe? When's the next episode coming out, do you think? The Energy Detox podcast?
Next week, because
Have you
there's a lot of topics, both here, certainly here in the Pittsburgh area, but a lot of changes of leadership, especially on the sports side, but certainly in government. Heck, even in Pittsburgh here, the Catholic Diocese of Pittsburgh will have a new bishop here. That was just announced. So sports, religion, energy, all kinds of leadership changes. So if that's not ripe for a leadership podcast episode, I don't know what is, Jason. So we'll
and
tackle that next week and see how it goes.
we'll have to have the special Joe Sinnott podcast too, as he tries to corral the troops as we're going to get the rig on the White House lawn. I'm serious about that. I'm going to craft a letter. I'm going to craft a letter, and I'm going to get this ball rolling, Joe. And yeah, I think that we'll have to have you do a podcast to invite the Marcellus to get behind maybe the signing of a petition, something along those lines. We'll have to think about this a little bit because I think we can get this done, Joe. I think we can get Donald Trump and Department of Energy, Chris Wright, to give Expand Energy an award for record-breaking laterals, for having record-breaking energy independence at a time when we need it most. I'm not, this is all organic wordsmithing here, so I got to take a little time, Joe, to do this because we're going to pay this with the proper respect, and we're going to, yeah, this sounds like something fun. I don't know.
I agree,
It
and
sounds
all we
fun.
need is some variant, as we said earlier, on the drain the swamp concept of draining a reservoir, and you're off to the races here with this idea, Jason. So.
God, could you imagine that? Draining of the swamp with Expand Energy using all I can think of is There Will Be Blood, where Daniel Day-Lewis is like, suck it out like a straw, Daniel, when he's just like, oh, I love that show. That's one of my favorite shows. There Will Be Blood. Probably what. Well, I love the industry so much. So, all right, winning partners, Joe Sinnott. Of course, he's the host of the Energy Detox podcast. Sir, any final thoughts? Any final words?
No, I'm just happy to be here. I never know what ideas are going to percolate up from a conversation on the Crude Life, Jason. So thank you for yet another enjoyable and far-ranging, wide-ranging, deeply ranging conversation.
And I've learned that I've got to either get a new light or I've got to get a tan, man. I'm looking like I'm in the Crypt Keeper territory here with this shade of gray I got going on. Woo! All right. We'll catch you on the flip side, folks.